My father didn't just take away my future that night, he handed it to me in a box he thought was empty. He stood in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, wearing that pressed Oxford shirt he always had on when he wanted to feel like a man making a serious decision. He looked at me the way you look at a vending machine that swallowed your dollar. Not angry exactly. Just done. Just finished with the transaction. I was 22 years old. I had just told him I wasn't going to law school, that I was dropping out of pre-law at University of Cincinnati after 3 years to move to Portland and take a job at a startup doing something he'd never understand and never tried to. Data infrastructure, the invisible skeleton inside every system that makes modern life run. He said 3 sentences. The first was a question that wasn't really a question. You think the world is just going to hand you something because you're smart? The second was a statement he'd probably been saving for years. I didn't sacrifice everything to watch you throw your life away on some Silicon Valley fantasy. The third was the one that changed everything. Then don't come back here expecting us to catch you when it falls apart. My mother was sitting at the kitchen table behind him, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold an hour ago. She didn't say a word. She just looked at the window above the sink, like there was something very important happening in the backyard. There wasn't. I packed 2 bags that night, left everything else. I remember standing in the driveway of that house in Columbus, Ohio, looking up at my bedroom window. The light was still on. I had lived in that room for 18 years. I turned around and didn't look back. Now I'm standing 41 floors above the city of Portland in an office that has floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides. It's a Tuesday morning in October and the mountains are out, which doesn't happen as often as tourists expect. My assistant, Jade, has just told me there are 2 people in the lobby asking to see me. They don't have an appointment. They say it's a family matter. I know who it is before I pull up the lobby feed. My father is wearing the same kind of pressed Oxford shirt. My mother is standing half a step behind him, the way she always has, looking at some invisible thing to his left. They both look older. Smaller somehow, the way people shrink when life has been pressing down on them for a long time. My father looks directly into the lobby camera and says something to the security desk. I can see his mouth moving. I've known that mouth my whole life. I know exactly what it's saying. He's asking to see his daughter. He's saying it's urgent. Before I tell you what happened when they walked through my door, I want to know you're here with me. Drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I've been telling this story for a long time in my own head. It feels different saying it out loud. Columbus, Ohio. 12 years ago. My name is Isla, and I need you to understand what kind of house I grew up in before any of the rest of this makes sense. My father, Leonard, was a tax attorney. Not a famous one, not a wealthy one, but a relentlessly competent one, with a small firm in the short north and a deep conviction that the only respectable path through life was the one he had already walked himself. Law school. Bar exam. A firm with your name on the door if you worked hard enough. Legacy. That word lived in our house the way some families keep religious icons, on every surface, in every conversation. He said it so often it stopped sounding like a word and started sounding like a warning. My mother, Patricia, had given up a graduate program in art history at Ohio State to marry him at 25. She never mentioned this. My aunt told me once, years later, after enough wine, my mother had wanted to study how medieval illuminated manuscripts traveled between monasteries, how knowledge moved through borders when borders were everything. Instead, she moved through the rooms of our house, keeping things clean and attending firm dinners and making sure I understood from a very young age that sacrifice was the primary currency of love. I didn't stood it. I just didn't accept it. I was good at school in the way that made teachers nervous. I didn't follow the lesson plan. I went sideways. I read the textbooks cover to cover the first week and then spent the rest of the semester asking questions nobody had thought to ask yet. My father took this as arrogance. My mother took this as anxiety. My AP computer science teacher, Mr. Bowen, was the first adult in my life who took it as something else entirely. He stayed after class one Thursday in March of my junior year and put a book on my desk. It wasn't a textbook. It was a collection of essays by engineers and architects of the early internet, people who had built the invisible infrastructure that the rest of the world was now living inside without ever thinking about. He said, "You think about systems the way most people think about people. That's rare. Don't let anyone flatten it. I didn't call him. I didn't call him. I didn't call him. Oh, it sits on the shelf behind my desk in this office. By the time I graduated and started college, I had already been accepted to a competitive summer internship at a tech firm in Columbus. My father made me turn it down. He said I needed to focus on the LSAT. I focused on pre-law for 3 years. I was miserable in the slow, specific way of someone who knows exactly what they should be doing and is doing something else entirely. The night I told my father I was leaving, I had already signed the offer letter. The job in Portland was real. The salary was more than he had made in his first 5 years of practice. I didn't tell him that part. I didn't think it would matter to him in the way I wanted it to. I was right. It didn't. The first year in Portland was the kind of hard that doesn't make it into inspirational posts. It was ramen and secondhand furniture and learning the bus routes at midnight because I couldn't afford parking. It was calling my aunt back in Dayton on Sundays because she was the only family member who didn't treat my choices like a personal insult. It was lying awake in a studio apartment that smelled like the previous tenant's dog, running through systems architecture problems in my head because it was the only thing that quieted the part of my brain that kept asking if I had made a catastrophic mistake. My aunt, whose name was June, and who made the best lemon pound cake in the state of Ohio and had the sharpest wit of anyone I have ever known, was the one who kept me from turning around. She called me every Sunday at noon without exception. She'd ask what I'd learned that week, not how I was doing, what I had learned. Like knowledge was the only real measure of whether a week had been worth something. She was the one who told me, about 8 months after I moved, that my father had told the extended family I was living in Portland doing something with computers. The quotation marks, she said, were audible. I laughed for the first time in a while. She was also the one who told me 6 years later that my parents were in serious financial trouble. I had built something by then, not the billion-dollar unicorn story that tech journalism likes to tell, something real and less glamorous and more durable. I had worked my way up at the startup, learned every system they had, and then identified the hole that everyone else had been too comfortable to look at directly. Data compliance infrastructure for mid-size healthcare organizations. Not exciting. Absolutely necessary. I didn't explain myself. I didn't call him a contract to the business instincts I didn't have. And within 3 years, we had 40 clients in 6 states. I did not call my father to tell him. I did not send an announcement. I moved forward the way I always had, which was by moving forward. But I kept a quiet eye on what was happening back in Columbus. Not out of bitterness. Out of the same instinct that makes a good systems engineer watch the logs even when everything seems to be running fine. You watch because you know what happens when you stop watching. What I saw, over several years, was this. My father's firm had lost 2 of its 3 senior partners to retirement, had taken on a large commercial real estate client whose tax exposure turned out to be catastrophic, and was now the subject of a state bar disciplinary inquiry that his malpractice insurer was declining to cover in full. He was 61 years old and he was running out of road. I watched all of this the way you watch weather moving in from a distance. I didn't try to stop it. I didn't warn him. I had no standing to warn him. I was the daughter he had told not to come back. I thought I was done with them. I had built a life that didn't have a space for that kind of pain in it. And then the lobby camera showed me their faces, and I realized that done is not the same thing as finished. I told Jade to send them up. I didn't stand when they came in. I stayed seated behind my desk, which is a large piece of reclaimed walnut I bought from a craftsman in Oregon City, and I watched them take in the room the way people always do when they're somewhere that resets their assumptions about who you are. My father sat down without being invited. My mother sat beside him, which was habit. He didn't ask how I was. He looked at the view for a moment, then looked at me and said, "We've had a difficult few years." I said, "I know." He paused. He hadn't expected that. He said, "Then you know why we're here." I said, "Tell me anyway." What came out over the next 20 minutes was a story delivered in the language of a man who had never once in his life asked anyone for anything and was discovering, at 61, that this particular skill set had an expiration date. The firm was effectively finished. The malpractice claim had been settled but had drained what remained of their savings. They had refinanced the Columbus house twice. My mother had quietly drained her own small retirement account, the one she had started in her 40s, without telling him, and it was gone too. They were current on the mortgage, but only until the end of the year. Then he said the thing he had come to say. He straightened in his chair first, the way he always did when he was about to deliver a judgment, even now when he was the one who needed something. He said, "You've done well for yourself. We'd like you to consider investing in the firm, a silent partnership. We think with your client network in the compliance space, we could restructure and recover." I let the silence sit for a moment, not to be cruel, because I genuinely needed to feel the edges of what I was hearing. I said, "You want me to fund the firm?" He said, "We want to keep the family together through this." The family. I looked at my mother. She was looking at the mountains. There was something so practiced about it, that particular direction of her gaze, that I understood for the first time it wasn't distance. It was a skill she had developed over 40 years, looking away just enough to maintain deniability about whatever was being said in the room. I said, "I'll think about it. Give me a few days." They left. I sit at the window for a long time after. I want to be honest about what I felt, because I think the easy version of this story is that I felt nothing, or that I felt only power. That's not what happened. What I felt was something much harder to hold, which was grief. For the family I had needed them to be, and they hadn't been. For the years I had spent building this life partly in response to the sound of that door not opening behind me. For the version of my mother who had wanted to study how knowledge moves through borders and had ended up looking out kitchen windows instead. I didn't sleep much that week. I ran the numbers. I had Scott look at the firm's financials, which my father had sent over in a folder that was, by any professional standard, a disaster. The malpractice exposure was worse than he'd admitted. There were 2 additional complaints filed with the bar that he hadn't mentioned, both from former clients of the commercial real estate matter. The refinancing on the house was on terms that suggested they'd gone to a lender who understood they had no other options. And then Scott found something else, something my father had not told me. 3 months earlier, my father had filed paperwork to restructure the firm under a new entity. The new entity listed a second partner. The second partner's name was a man named Vincent, who had been one of the senior partners who retired 2 years ago. There was nothing unusual about this except for one thing. The new entity listed a capital contribution from an unnamed family investor, pending in the amount of $400,000. That line had been in the paperwork for 3 months. The paperwork had been filed 3 months before my father showed up in my lobby. He hadn't come to ask me. He had come to collect what he had already told someone else was coming. I sat with that for 2 days. I thought about the girl in that driveway, looking up at a lit window, making the decision to turn around. I thought about my aunt calling every Sunday asking what I'd learned. I thought about the book on the shelf behind me, the one about the architects of invisible systems, and about Mr. Bowen saying, "Don't let anyone flatten it." I thought about my mother's retirement account. She had drained it. She had never said a word. She had sat behind him in that lobby, and she had sat across from me in my office looking at mountains, and she had not said a single word of her own. I made 2 phone calls. The first was to a forensic accountant I had used twice before on client matters. Her name was Theodora, and she was extraordinarily good at finding the things that weren't meant to be found. I sent her everything Scott had pulled together and told her I needed a full picture in 5 business days. The second call was to my father. I told him I was ready to discuss terms. I invited them both back to the office the following Friday afternoon. When they arrived, I had coffee ready, which I had no intention of drinking. I let my father present his pitch. It had slides this time, printed and bound, which impressed me in a grim way. He had put effort into this. Vincent had helped him put together projections that looked, if you didn't know what to look for, almost credible. When he finished, he looked at me with the expression I remembered from childhood, the one that meant the verdict had been delivered and what remained was simply compliance. I said, "Before we talk about numbers, I want to show you something." Theodora had given me more than I expected. The new firm entity was structured in a way that would have made me a capital contributor with no meaningful governance rights. The $400,000 would have gone in, and Vincent, not my father, had operational control. My father appeared to have understood this and not mentioned it. Whether he understood the full scope of what Vincent had constructed, I genuinely don't know. It doesn't actually matter. What I put on the desk was a 3-page summary. I slid one copy to my father and one to my mother. I said, the capital contribution you described would not have gone to the firm. It would have gone into an entity that your former partner controls. You either knew that or you were being used to bring in my money for someone else's recovery. Either way, the answer is no. My father's face went through several things quickly. He picked up the document. He put it down. He said something about due diligence and timing and how I had never understood how business actually worked. I said, I didn't exactly how this works. My mother said something then. It was the first thing she had said directly to me since they arrived. She said, Isla, we needed you to say yes. Not we hoped, not we thought you might. We needed you to say yes, like it had already been spent. I looked at her for a moment. I thought about art history and illuminated manuscripts and knowledge moving through borders. I said, I know you did. Then I said what I had decided to say, which I want you to understand had nothing to do with revenge, and everything to do with the only kind of clarity that comes from 12 years of building something with your own hands. I said, I'm not going to fund the firm, but I'm going to do something else. I had already spoken to a colleague who ran a financial restructuring consultancy in Columbus. He owed me a referral, and I had called it in. I slid a third document across the desk. It was a referral letter with his direct contact information and a note that he would take their case at a reduced rate as a professional courtesy. I said, the house can probably be saved if you move quickly. The firm probably can't, but that may not be the worst outcome. There's a pathway through this that doesn't end in complete disaster if you start it in the next 30 days. My father looked at the referral letter. He looked at it for a long time. He said, this isn't what we came for. I said, I know, but it's what I have to give you. He stood up. He took the letter. My mother picked up her copy of Theodora's summary and put it carefully in her bag, which told me something I couldn't quite read. At the door, my father turned around. He had that expression again, the one from the kitchen doorway 12 years ago. The pressed Oxford shirt. The man delivering a judgment. He said, you always had to do things your own way. I said, yes, I did. He left. My mother paused in the doorway. She didn't look at the mountains this time. She looked at me. She said, the firm in Columbus you sent us to, is he good? I said, he's the best I know for this kind of situation. She nodded. She said, okay. Then she walked out. Jade appeared in the doorway 2 minutes later and asked if I needed anything. I said no. I sat there for a while looking at the mountains myself, which was something I generally avoided as too obvious. But sometimes obvious is what the moment actually calls for. The restructuring consultant did his job. The Columbus house was refinanced on manageable terms through a program for homeowners in financial distress. The firm was wound down cleanly, which meant my father's bar standing wasn't further complicated. The disciplinary inquiry was resolved with a formal reprimand, which was painful for him and, given the circumstances, appropriate. He now works as a contract attorney for a mid-size firm in Dublin, Ohio. He is not a named partner. He does careful work and goes home at 5 o'clock. My mother enrolled in an online certificate program in art history through Ohio State 6 months after everything settled. She sent me an email about it. It was the first direct communication between us in 12 years that wasn't conducted through the furniture of my father's agenda. The email was 3 sentences, and one of them was about a medieval manuscript held at the Morgan Library in New York that she had wanted to see for 30 years. I read it 4 times. I wrote back. We have been writing back since then. It is slow, and it is careful, and it is, I think, the beginning of something real, which is more than I expected and maybe more than I deserve to expect. I drove out to the coast last spring, to a stretch of shoreline south of Cannon Beach where the rocks come out of the water like arguments and the wind is cold even in May. I had the referral letter that the restructuring consultant had sent back to me after the engagement closed, a standard practice, he told me, returned with a note that said, your people made it through. Simple as that. I stood at the water for a long time, not doing anything dramatic, just standing there with the wind coming off the Pacific, thinking about the driveway in Columbus and the lit window, and the bags I had packed and the decision I had made to turn away from it. I hadn't been looking for a moment of release. I had been looking for the ocean, which is what I generally look for when the systems in my head need a reset. But I thought about my aunt, who had called every Sunday at noon, who had made lemon pound cake and asked what I learned, who had kept me facing forward when facing forward required real effort. She had been diagnosed 2 years ago with a form of early Parkinson's. She was managing it with the same sharpness and dry humor she had managed everything else. Last Sunday, she called at noon, same as always, and asked what I'd learned that week. I told her I was learning that finishing something is different from being done with it. That being done is a protection. Finishing is something else. It takes longer. It's quieter. It doesn't feel like what you expected it to feel like. She said, "That sounds about right." Then she asked if I wanted the lemon pound cake recipe, because she'd been meaning to give it to me for years and neither of us was getting any younger. I said yes. I have it now, written in her handwriting on a card she mailed me, which is a thing she did because she believes some information should travel through the physical world. The card is on the shelf in my office, next to the book Mr. Bowen left on my desk in March of my junior year. Family is not the kitchen doorway that holds you to someone else's blueprint. It's not the name that comes with conditions attached, or the silence that asks you to keep looking out the window at something that isn't there. Family is the person who calls at noon on Sunday and asks what you learned. It's the card written in someone's handwriting. It's the book left on a desk by someone who saw you clearly and told you not to let anyone flatten it. I got back in my car at Cannon Beach and drove north. The mountains were out. I had a conference call at 3 and a new client onboarding on Thursday, and a text from my aunt that said, "Don't forget the zest." That's the whole thing with lemon cake. The zest. I laughed out loud in the car, by myself, on a Tuesday in May, on the coast of Oregon. I had built a life that had room in it for that laugh. Room for Sunday calls and pound cake recipes and conference calls, and the long, slow work of writing back to someone who used to look out windows. My father had stood in a kitchen doorway 12 years ago and told me not to come back expecting to be caught. I didn't call him, call him. I didn't become Mech eventually because I had built something solid enough to stand on, and from something solid you can afford to reach. There's a specific kind of pain that comes from being dismissed by someone who is supposed to see you clearly, not rejected by a stranger. Dismissed by your own father. Leonard didn't yell at me the night I told him I was leaving. He didn't have to. The way he crossed his arms in that kitchen doorway said everything his voice didn't bother to. "You are making a mistake. I will not be responsible for." And somehow, for years, I carried that framing around like it was mine to carry. What I've learned, slowly and not without cost, is that actions move in one direction through time, and they leave things behind them. My father spent 2 decades building a career on the idea that his way was the only way worth taking. He made that decision again and again in small rooms and firm dinners and the quiet management of a household organized around his blueprint. He didn't build something corrupt. He built something brittle. When it cracked completely, and the weight of it fell on everyone who had stayed in the structure. I didn't stay in the structure. That is the whole story, really. What I want to say, and I mean this as something I had to earn the right to understand, not something I was handed, is that integrity is not about being right. It's about being honest with yourself about what you actually know and what you're willing to be responsible for. I knew, at 22, that I understood systems in a way that had value. I knew that suppressing it to perform someone else's idea of a respectable life would make me dishonest in ways that would eventually show up in every room I walked into. The ethical choice for me was to leave. It didn't feel like an ethical choice at the time. It felt terrifying. But the two things are not mutually exclusive. My Aunt June used to say that intelligence isn't what you know, it's what you do with what you notice. She noticed things. She noticed that I needed to hear the right question more than I needed to hear the right answer. "What did you learn this week?" That question, asked every Sunday for years, trained me to stay curious when the easier thing would have been to get defensive or small. The sharpest tool I brought to every professional situation in my life wasn't a credential. It was the habit of looking directly at what was actually there, even when it was inconvenient, even when it complicated everything. And then there's the part that nobody talks about enough, which is that none of it means anything without the willingness to keep going on the days when keeping going requires real effort. The first year in Portland was not inspiring. It was a studio apartment and bus routes, and a brain that kept running worst-case scenarios at 2 in the morning. Persistence is not glamorous. It is mostly just the refusal to stop on a bad Tuesday. I got through a lot of bad Tuesdays. My father came to my office because he had run out of options. I said no to what he asked for, and yes to what he actually needed. I don't think that was justice in any dramatic sense. I think it was just the most honest thing available to me in that room. I'm still learning the difference between being finished with something and being free of it. I think freedom takes longer. I think it arrives quietly, in the form of a recipe card in someone's handwriting, or a Sunday call at noon, or a laugh alone in a car on a Tuesday in May. I think it arrives when you've built something real enough that you can afford to reach toward the people who didn't believe you would.